Hi, welcome. Hi. So the video we're recording here is mainly intended to describe to you this cognitive psychology concept that we call perceptual set. It informs a lot about the way we view the world, and in particular, it might help you figure out why you saw the dress, the color you saw the dress. Do you remember the dress? It was a few years ago. There was this dress meme online that was, when some people looked at it, it was, I think, black and blue, and when other people looked at it, it was white and gold. Perceptual set can actually explain this process. It's all based on previous knowledge and expectations. So essentially, the assumptions that your mind automatically made about the background color of the photo around the dress informed what color your mind thought the dress was. So some people saw it one way or the other because of the visual context they saw it in, if the screen around it was brighter or darker. But other people just had natural assumptions about whether the room behind the dress was light or dark. The same is true for that other kind of viral sound somewhere around the same time where some people felt like they heard Yanny and some people felt like they heard Laurel. For one thing, those sounds are similar enough sonically that you can kind of mush them together, and if you play them one over the top of the other, then you're kind of going to lead yourself one way or another. But all that is, again, expectations, and that's the essential nature of perceptual set. So what we're going to go through here is how we understand perceptual set, what the rules are that govern the visual part of perceptual set, according to a group of German psychologists. That should give you the information you need, I think, to try to understand why the dress is the color it is for you and why that might not be the same color for the person next to you, even though we know from discoveries about color theory that everyone does see the same color, so we're not going to go totally off the rails here. So on the basic side, visual perception is all about edges. The occipital lobe in the back of your brain that's interpreting the information that comes from your eyes is looking for the edges of things, lines out in the world, and how those lines form into shapes, and then what eventually fills in those shapes. The brain then, through activity in a lot of other areas, including the frontal lobe, information it's getting probably from the parietal lobe and your disposition of where you are in the world, puts it all together to make objects, and then adds in knowledge, context, and experience to enable us to build what a cognitive psychologist would call a perceptual set, which is the decision mainly about what the thing is that you're looking at. We can't decide, we can't label the objects in our perceptual field, in our visual field in particular, without some knowledge of what we usually see. And so we combine what we know about the world with what we're seeing in front of us to come to conclusions about what we're seeing. And this process leads us to do all kinds of things accurately and quickly, like identify objects around us in the room, understand how far away something might be based on the difference in the view from our left or our right eye, or our understanding of the fact that things get smaller as they get farther away. And all of this is built into a number of, not exactly rules, but principles of the understanding of perception that were theorized by, of course, German psychologists more than 100 years ago, because every psychologist was German back then. Not every, but that's where it started. They're called the Gestalt theories of perception. So Gestalt is a German word for shape, and the concept here is that the mind organizes everything it is perceiving visually into reasonable groups, reasonable shapes based on past experience. So we have typical forms and shapes that we see all the time. For example, especially in the modern world, we see a lot of vertical and horizontal lines. It's true in nature as well, a lot of horizontal ground out in the distance and vertical things like trees. But in the built world, in the human-built world, we're surrounded, just look around me, it's all horizontal and vertical lines. There's not really anything too diagonal happening here. We are so used to horizontal and vertical lines that the brain is tuned to watch for them and isn't really tuned to watch for diagonal lines in the same way. What it does is it measures how far from horizontal a line is. It's not directly measuring diagonal lines. It's not directly noticing them. It's saying that line is horizontal minus a couple degrees. In other words, we have typical forms and shapes and lines that we're looking for, trying to recognize what goes on in our environment. We also know all kinds of things about depth. We've gathered over the course of our young lives information about how to tell when something is closer or further from you, using things like the distance between our two eyeballs and the angle at which we see something. That's a sort of subconscious part of depth perception. But we also look at something that's very far away and notice it's clearly just far away. That's not a tiny tree I'm looking at. That's a tree that's a couple hundred yards away from me. Or if you look at a door that is partly ajar, you don't go, ooh, what a weird parallelogram shaped door. You go, that door is open a little bit, and that's why it looks like it's not a rectangle to me at this moment, but I know it's still a rectangle. So all this kind of knowledge and expectation about the world is what fills in the Gestalt theory of perception, which is more or less based on this concept that is another German word. It's Prägens, which is the idea that the world is orderly and simple and more or less symmetrical. So when we see an object out in the world, we fall back on Prägens and we assume that it makes sense to us based on our previous experience and based on simplicity and good order and symmetricality, if that comes into play. So within the Gestalt theory of perception, there are specific rules. So the first is proximity. When things are close together, we assume that those two things are grouped. If a set of 6 lines is equally spaced, they don't necessarily look like any of them belong together. But if those 6 lines instead are closer to each other in some groupings, so say there's 2 close to another, and then there's a big space, and then 2 other lines close together, a space, and 2 more, those lines that are close together look like little groups to us. So that law of proximity comes into play, and we, rather than saying that's 6 lines, we say that is 3 groups of 2 lines, or 3 bars being outlined. There's another called continuity, or the law of good continuation. You can think about this when you look at a hose all wrapped up on the ground. So when you look at a hose kind of spun into a pile, you don't go, oh, there's a bunch of chunks of hose that happen to be laying across each other here. You know that the hose continues, right? You know that the line goes as it sort of coils down toward the ground or toward the end of the hose or whatever it is. So think of a rope in the same way. You also could imagine crossing 2 ropes and noticing, you wouldn't necessarily think if you saw ropes cross this way that they are a V and an upside down V. You would know this is 2 ropes crossing and that they can be separated. This is what they would look like based on this Gestalt law of good continuation. There's another called closure. So here you could picture a triangle with no outline and no color in it, overlapping 3 colored in circles just on the corners, such that the circles would look kind of like little Pac-Man figures. So when we see something like that, or you could also actually imagine the Olympic rings. When we see images like that, we don't think that we're looking at 8 different shapes, some of which are circles with little half moons cut out, and then a bunch of sort of strange kind of rounded diamond shapes. We think we're looking at rings that are overlapping each other because we see the continuation of the circle and we assume the simplicity of the circle and the symmetricality of the circle. Constancy is another major topic in the Gestalt theories of perception. It's another of these rules. There are lots of kinds of constancy. Probably the most important to think of are shape, size, and color. All kind of the same story. When we know what something is and we see it from a different angle or from a different distance or in a slightly different color, we don't go, oh, that's a brand new thing I've never seen before. We go, that is the thing I've seen, just slightly different. If the lights all turn off and the color of my door in my office here becomes darker, I'm not going to say, oh man, I have this darker door, I don't know what to do with it anymore. Will it still work the same way? Is it still a door? I don't have to assess that even subconsciously because my mind knows through this Gestalt process of perceiving that it's still the same thing. It's the same object. And this is good, right? You can imagine, just as an aside, you can imagine how this is good and helpful for us to feel comfortable in our environments and for us to feel like we have some control of what's going on around us, right? Is if we had to reassess every single object around us at all times, it would really stress people out, right? It would be hard to figure out. Let's say you're driving and you see a car in a new shape that you've never seen before. Well, they do that every year. They come out with all kinds of new shapes of cars. If it really terrified you to see a new shape until you figured out that it was a car through some kind of bottom-up building block-based processing, we'd have a lot more stressed out drivers than we already do out there. And so that process would be hugely helped and is hugely helped by this object recognition and event and person recognition process that is this Gestalt set of theories. One last useful rule in the Gestalt theories of perception is the law of common fate. So if there is a group of items, a group of people that all appear to be clumped together, but then you can see that they are moving 2 different or maybe 2 distinct ways. You might then start to group them into 2 different meaningful groups based on what you view to be their common fate. So imagine you're in like a public transit station of some kind. You're in a bus station or you're in a subway station, and there is just a big clump of people in the middle of the station. You might not know who's going which direction. Let's imagine you can't tell the way they're facing. Trains pull up on either side, and everybody starts moving toward a train then you now can tell these are two very different groups of people. One's going one direction, one's going the other. That's the law of common fate. They would cease to be one group to us. They would now be two groups because they are all moving in unison within the group. The point of all this is that we've built these structures in our minds. We have gathered knowledge and expectations and experience in the world that helps us perceive things as we usually see them. It makes our day-to-day lives much simpler. It makes our processing much easier and efficient. And that's good for us. It helps us think faster. It helps us stay safer. And it also helps us feel more consistent as human beings, which is an important piece of mental health. We have to feel like we are who we are when we get up every single day, and having the world around us be familiar is a good piece of that. And perceptual set enables us to feel that familiarity. There's another video potentially following this in which we would discuss where perceptual set can lead us astray, and those are things like visual illusions, which is a topic for another video. But thanks for watching this one, and if you're in class, I'll see you in the next one.